There's so many demands on money. But we need money for poverty alleviation, building infrastructure, repairing the Ukraine, spending money for climate change. No longer do we have a mentality like an individual might have. They might say, how much money do we have and what should we spend it on? The big difference between individuals and governments is the governments don't have that constraint because they can print money. So I think we have this trade-off. Whenever in history you have a lot of debt and a lot of financial assets, it becomes very, very difficult for those to be balanced. And we're now in a shift. The prior decade, we had falling interest rates, which were goods for holders of bonds. Cash was very cheap, free almost. And so the whole investment landscape was very much built around that. Now we're having this adjustment away from that. So central banks try to balance growth and inflation. And so it will be a difficult balance, which creates an environment of stagflation, I'm afraid. Over the long run, look at your returns relative to inflation. Whichever country you're in, whichever currency you're denominated in, look at the returns relative to inflation. Too many people look at just the level of returns and they don't pay enough attention to inflation. Generally stay away from debt-denominated assets. Third, have a well-diversified portfolio. Diversification reduces risk without reducing expected returns if you do it well. Also, don't be too tactical. I think you have to realize that the markets are a zero-sum game. To compete in the markets is more difficult than competing in the Olympics because there are more people trying to do it and taking money away from others. So have a strategy which is over a long period of time, to save money in a diversified portfolio of assets. So those would be the most important things, I think.
Power axis, the changing political power axis that you alluded to between US and China. But, we've lived 75 years without any kind of major war globally. Do you think that era is about to change? Because you've spoken very ominously of late about a period of 1930 to 1945, which you think the world is veering back to.
Yes. In my book, which is an extension of a study that I did, I needed to go back in history and follow and examine what happened when conditions were similar to today. And so you will see in that book, it's called The Changing World Order. You will see in that book, and by the way, there's a video called the YouTube video called The Changing World Order. It's free and it's entertaining and it's informative. You'll see in that measures that go back 500 years and you will see cycles. Cycles are just, it's nothing predestined by a cycle other than their mechanical cause-effect linkages. And so if we look at the financial issues we just talked about, size of the wealth gap, printing of money and all, if you look at the internal conflicts, and use measures, size of the wealth gap, size of political gaps, amount of populism and the like. And if you look at the external factors, the conflicts between countries, the military buildup and such, they are all, each one of those, the highest levels since the 1930 to 45 period. And you go back over periods of time, and they all interrelate to make less peaceful periods of greater conflict. And that's a period that we're in. And so when we look at that, you can see the geopolitical. In India, it's all big countries and many little countries are in the middle of that. So what we're seeing is no longer the minor country confrontations, something like the United States and Afghanistan or Iraq. It is now Russia and China. And there are 5 kinds of wars. There is a trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war, a capital and economic war, and a military war, 5 of those. We are in the first 4 of those. If we never go to a military war, we are still having damage happening because we are still in an environment where globalization as we know it is declining. Because right now, in fears of those wars, there is the desire for self-sufficiency. It used to be that the world would come close to producing items and trading items wherever it was most efficient. That is now changing. Now it's wherever it's most secure. So you're seeing that change in global economics happen in an important way, resulting from these geopolitical changes. And we could find ourselves in a military war. I'm not saying that that's inevitable. I'm saying, though, that right now, there is not a United Nations or world court that resolves disputes. They're resolved in terms of these types of fighting. So, yes, it's very much an influence. And those influences then affect countries differently. Those that are in wars of those types have more problems than those that are out. Neutrality is important. The 3 things that I look at when I'm looking at countries is first, the financial. Do they earn more than they are spending financially? Do they have a good income statement and good balance sheet? Second, do people within the country operate in a harmonious, effective way? Healthy competition, but not destructive, political, dysfunctional behavior. And number 3, are they at risk of an international war, or are they more neutral and staying out of the international war? If they are those 3, financially sound, operating well with each other, and operating in a way where there's minimal risk of being directly involved and they're more neutral. It's important to distinguish the price of a stock and its up and down movement versus its prospects. So there was a bubble in tech stocks. Mostly what's happening is that a number of these have negative cash flows. That means they didn't have earnings that will support those prices. And in many cases, they didn't have earnings. And they relied on either borrowing money to make up the gap or raising venture capital or private equity money. And free and plentiful money was basically the paradigm. And so you're now seeing those companies who have negative cash flows be severely hurt, because if the money doesn't come in, then they'll go broke. They'll run out of money. They have to contract and so on. And we're seeing that happen. So that's different than the fact that we are at a point where it is the bright spot of inventiveness. So our society will see it. Depending on where investors buy, they may not see it. But you're in an environment now where inventiveness is greater than it has ever been in history, because technologies have helped thinking. We have technologies that can supplement our thinking abilities. And we also have a venture capital market that means that it is easy, not as easy as it was just recently, but it is still relatively easy for those who have good ideas before they're prepared to be public companies to be able to get capital to be able to test out those ideas before they're brought public. We have a political election now in the United States, midterm. I think that also we have an economic cycle. I think both are going to get worse in the United States and elsewhere. So you're going to have more internal conflict, and you're going to have, at the same time, more economic problems as we have stagflation. And that'll take us into in the United States, the 2024 election. Similar patterns are happening around the world. I think that's going to be very difficult. It's also going to have a difficulty because the international conflicts are not going to improve substantially. So I think that as we go into the 2024 period, you're going to encounter more of those problems. At the same time, I think probably there's the cost, not just the effects of climate. Climate remediation is estimated to cost $9 trillion a year in order to reach goals which probably won't be reached. And who's going to pay for that money? That's very expensive at this time. So I think between now and 2024, it'll become an increasingly difficult period, but there'll be good inventions and there'll be good developments. So I think that if I was to pick a period of time that I think will be particularly challenging, it'll be in the vicinity of 24, 25, perhaps. In other words, if this just becomes an evolutionary struggle, we'll get through this. Even in depressions, most people can't remain employed. Even in wars, most people don't get killed. In other words, it's a difficulty, and individuals who are smart can navigate such things. We'll get through it. It takes a while, but we'll get through it. The main thing is, avoiding the wars. And I think if we think that peace and prosperity are possible, and it really mostly depends on how we are with each other, I think that that's a beacon that we can look at the choice and hopefully handle it well.